And welcome back to Gleaning and Gathering. I'm your host, Eric Heimlich, once again back behind the old microphone and endeavoring to share what I am gleaning and gathering. This past summer has been interesting so far. In the last 3 weeks, I've been to 2 different reunions. One for our family and another for Rochelle's family. We traveled to Missouri to be with her family and just had an amazing time. I think there were about 120, something like that, people there. It had been a number of years since everyone was all together and had some amazing boiled peanuts, played some basketball. There was a lot of singing, of course, a lot of food. She comes from a family that originated in Mississippi, and she was actually born in Jackson, Mississippi, and then they moved to Missouri after a few years, and that's where she spent most of her growing up life, and then moved to Indiana after she married me. So that was the history there. And being back together with all of the family gathered from all kinds of different places. They took pictures of all the first cousins and the second cousins and then even some of the third cousins. It was so cute to see the youngest generation picture and all those little ones. But it was a wonderful time. And then the family reunion that our family had, there was a number of the cousins that were all descendants of Verlin and Cora May Heimlich. And it got me thinking about them and thinking about the whole idea of heritage and the blessing that it is and the influence that it has on our lives. My grandpa was saved, I think it was 1979, that God really got a hold of his heart. And Grandma Marie, they called her Marie Heimlich, had been a real influence on Grandpa's life. And she was the one really who prayed him in, and he was saved and just remarkably saved, just miraculously, really, how God got a hold of him. He had been a Marine, was in the South Pacific, saw action in Saipan, and was there in Iwo Jima and the cleanup crew after Nagasaki. It was just a really brutal time, and saw a lot, and then came back home and began to farm. Married Grandma after 4 months of knowing her, and brought her from Tucumcari, New Mexico, back here to Indiana to continue farming. Raised 4 kids, including my dad, and bought this farm and farmed it after his grandmother sold it to him, and then lived here for that period of time. And so this, what we call Victory Acres today, was the old home place. I've been in the family for 7 generations total. If you trace it all the way back into the 1800s, it was homesteaded during Martin Van Buren's administration back in the 1830s, and it just has a long, rich history. If Grandpa would have lived this year, he and Grandma would have turned 100 years old, and it's been 20 years ago since he passed away. And so it was just an amazing time of sharing memories, and my mother dug through the archives and found a recording of Grandpa sharing his testimony, and I wanted to share that with you now.
I think of what Brother Humble told us, that the little boy said, I ought to just say amen and sit down. I don't have a testimony so much as just a few things that seem like have just went around in my mind the last 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe not even hardly relate to one another. But I want to thank God for where He's brought me from. I think it's important that we remember where we came from, where we started out from. Always remember what we were before we started this way. I know a man that is way up in years now, and I'm sure there's quite a few of you remember knowing him. And he told me one time when he quit the cigarette habit, he traveled in his car quite a bit, and he just threw them up on the dashboard, and he said they laid there for 2 or 3 years. He said, I never wanted to forget what I'd left behind. I never wanted to turn back. I didn't want to go back. But I never wanted to forget what I'd been brought from. I think it's important that we do that. The last couple of weeks we've had Sunday school lessons on consideration and love. Consideration is love. Love is consideration for others. We had a little story in our devotional book about a man that no doubt lived in a foreign country. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a person with leprosy. It's about the most horrible disease it can be, I believe. But it was talking about this man was going down a narrow path, and he met a person that had leprosy. And of course he immediately stopped and drew back, and then he became ashamed of doing this. And he went up to him and he hugged him and he kissed him and then passed on. And when he looked back, there was no one there. His thought was that there was not a leper on the path, but was Christ teaching him his love. In our Sunday school lesson, so many times we look down on others at the cross that they bear, their beliefs, their non-beliefs, and so forth. Our lesson today had a little saying that I thought was too good to pass up. That Jesus did not say it would be by standards or by doctrines. That all men would know we were his disciples, but by our love. Surely a service such as this is portraying our love for Jesus. I do thank him tonight for where he's brought me, what he's brought me from.
I'm incredibly grateful for the heritage that I have and for the difference that God made in Grandpa's life and in Grandma's life, and the way that he just brought them together and led them to him. And the only Grandpa I ever knew, I was born in 1978. He was saved in 1979. And the only Grandpa I never knew was the Grandpa who had been transformed by the grace of God, and not the Grandpa that was the Marine that was a smoker and just a very hardened man. But he was a man who had been transformed by the grace of God. And when I met him, he was just incredibly wise, a man who had seen a lot of life, a lot of challenges, but someone who had been just arrested by love and brought into a right relationship with God. And it was just a tremendous, tremendous blessing to have him as my grandpa. And so I don't know where you're at, but I want to encourage you to take a look at your history, at your family history, and also at your spiritual history. Who are those people in your life that are the fathers, that are the mothers, that are the mentors, that have passed down a legacy to you? And I want you to reflect on that and be grateful for it, because more than ever in this day and age, we need people who have deep roots, who have an understanding of where they've come from, and who have an understanding of the kind of work that God is doing in their family and in their lives. I'm not a big believer in generational curses, but there are things that get passed down. There are things that get passed along, whether it's inadvertent or whether it's purposeful. And I believe that one of the things that we can do for our kids' sake is to recognize what are those challenges that have come down to us because of choices that have been made in the past. And how can we help the younger generation to stand on our shoulders, to teach them the things that they need to learn, and also to help them to learn from our mistakes, to learn from the things that could have and should have been different. And I don't know what those are in your life, but I know that God made an incredible difference in my grandpa's life, and that passed down to us as I had the opportunity and privilege of being a part of Jefferson Christian Church, and my grandpa was part of that congregation until he died. It was such a blessing to go to church, to sit on the other end of the pew, from my grandparents, between my parents and my grandparents, and to see God at work in his life. And that's the kind of heritage that he passed down to me. A man who loved God. And I still remember the day that he went home to heaven, and we were surrounding that chair that he was in as he was laid back in that reclining chair. And as we were singing, and he just so peacefully entered into heaven. It made me think of the words, I believe it was, of John Wesley, who said, "Our people die well." And when I was there that day and saw just how peacefully Grandpa entered into his eternal rest, I thought, I want to die like that. I want to live like that, and I want to die in such a way that there's no doubt. There's no doubt at all about how I lived and where I'm headed. That's the kind of legacy, that's the kind of heritage that we can pass along if we live purposefully and if we live intentionally and we live for Christ. Only one life, it'll soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. That's what's on my mind today. And for Gleaning and Gathering, God bless.